Anyway, today we have a special treat. David Selkyver is going to talk to us. And David earned his PhD degree in economics from Harvard in 1970. And then he was 2 years in the public health system till 1972, when he joined the faculty at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, which, as you know, has been very much in the news with COVID and everything else, but it's a wonderful school of public health. And he was on the faculty there for, I think, 35 years. And then following that, when he retired from that, he was for about 5 years at the University of Maryland, also in the School of Public Health. And the topic that he's going to talk to us about today is something that I know he's passionate about, because he's told me about it. We've had evenings discussing it, and we've been directed to websites, etc. And anyway, it's probably very important for the survival of our democracy. So we're really excited about this. And just to whet your appetite also, his other passion, other than the topic he's going to talk to us about, is financing of health. And I hope we'll hear more about that at a future time. David, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Michael. And thanks to Larissa and Nancy and the staff here for making sure that reducing the probability that I won't trip all over the technology, but no promises. I do want to start with a couple of preliminary notes and, in a sense, warnings to you. Some of you may be expecting that my talk today will be as entertaining and inspiring as my wife Mary's was last month. And I'm sure that you will quickly find out that that's not at all the case here today. It's going to be rather dry and academic. And for that reason, I also have an unusual request to make about cell phones. Now, typically, we're always asking people to turn off their cell phones, at a gathering like this, lest you somehow disturb the proceedings. I do prefer that you not talk on your cell phones. However, it occurred to me that, particularly since it's after lunch and this talk will be very dry, that there may be some of you who are sleeping. And it might be helpful if someone else nearby has a cell phone that starts ringing if you fall asleep. So I'm saying it's perfectly okay with me if you leave your cell phones on, just don't talk on them. Anyway, how do I want to proceed? I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of my own kind of journey into thinking about political matters such as we'll talk about today. Then I want to talk in some specifics about some very recent experience I had in actually trying to evaluate volunteer efforts in terms of electoral outcomes and impacting them. I'll then spend a little bit of time talking about what some other real experts have come up with in terms of studying this general subject, and where that leaves me to suggest to you in terms of what to think about going forward and how to proceed. I guess I do prefer that you hold off on questions unless something is totally obscure until we get to the end of the presentation, which will be relatively brief. So the reason for my talking about this subject today really grew out of a convergence of two trends that I think some of you are also familiar with as well. One is a growing frustration with our polarized and often quite impotent political system. and the other is the recent proliferation of volunteer opportunities that we hear about and that are claimed to promote real progress by affecting electoral outcomes. Now, we all know that venting about the sorry state of our politics sometimes makes us feel a little bit better, but it doesn't really solve problems. So the question arises, is there something else, anything else that we can do to impact these problems, to be part of the solution as armchair volunteers? And I mean that sort of literally, in armchair in the sense of ambulation is not required. All you have to do is be able to, handwrite or pack on a computer, and you can participate. So how did I get to this point? Well, my initial experience in terms of my life experiences really started out back in, I suppose, all the way back maybe more than 50 years ago. I think I was first aware of political interests when I played hooky from school to watch the Army McCarthy hearings in the mid-1950s. Turned out that was interesting, and it was somewhat dramatic in terms of contributing to some major changes in Senator McCarthy's career, although I'm not sure it made a huge difference in terms of the politics of the country. And then following that, I really did not have much involvement in politics at all. In high school, graduate school, college, I was not involved in political campaigns really in any important degree until during my graduate school days, the Vietnam War heated up, and I suddenly started thinking about the implications for myself and lots of other folks who were potentially draft eligible. So my wife Mary and I started at least occasional activities in things like anti-war protests and a bit of electioneering in terms of door-to-door canvassing for politicians who we thought would be more responsive to our concerns about the bringing the war to a rapid end and other concerns. Then we kind of otherwise became occupied with things like kids and career and stuff like that for another 40 years or so. And it really wasn't until, I suppose, after the election of Barack Obama in 2008 and then, of course, the Tea Party wave in 2010 that we started thinking more about having more political participation. We did some canvassing door to door on behalf of Obama in 2012 and other candidates in 2016 and 2018, mostly in neighboring states. We lived in Maryland, which was deep blue, but we did go and do some canvassing in Pennsylvania and Virginia, that really got us, I think, more involved in this whole area of volunteering and political campaigns. Then, of course, time catches up with all of us, and we began realizing that door-to-door canvassing was pretty challenging if, in fact, you have various orthopedic problems like a bad back or a bad hip. So all of a sudden, things like doing armchair volunteering, writing letters, and that sort of stuff looked a lot more appealing to us. So that's when we started paying a lot more attention to that kind of activity. And I've done a fair amount of it over the last couple of years in terms of writing, especially volunteer letter writing and postcard writing for various political campaigns. Now, of course, the question arises that when you start thinking about how much time you should be spending on this stuff, the question arises as to whether it makes any difference. Are you, in fact, going to be impacting any electoral outcomes or public policies by doing these kinds of volunteer activities? My instinct as an economist was to look closely at statistics on the outcomes of these various sorts of volunteer programs that have sprung up, and asked myself, what does the data actually show on these programs? Can they work? Do we know anything about what does work and what doesn't work? That brought me then to some very recent volunteer activities in working with a local organization called Swing Blue Alliance, which started up in Cambridge and has been getting involved in various volunteer canvassing, letter writing, other sorts of political activities, for some time. We didn't really get involved in it. I didn't really get involved in it until last May, when we knew we were going to be moving up to this area, and that's when it was my first opportunity to connect to Swing Left of what was then Swing Left of Greater Boston, and now is known as Swing Blue Alliance. So I volunteered to help them evaluate the impact of recent postcard campaigns in the 2020 election. What they were doing was collaborating with several county Democratic parties in Florida in these volunteer efforts. And they asked me, really after the fact, because this all related to the 2020 election, they asked me if I would help look at what they had done in 2020 to see if it made any difference. And that was really how I got involved. I was really happy to take the opportunity to use the statistical analysis tools that I had been using for years in looking at health programs, and moving into a completely different area that I thought might still be impactful. So in these particular programs, and this is where we're talking now about my recent experience here, in these particular programs, volunteers addressed and signed postcards, and we'll look at them shortly, that were sent to registered Democrats in several Florida counties for the 2020 presidential election. The cards encouraged voters to request a mail ballot and vote by mail, and the idea was that these recipients would want to vote by mail in preference to voting in person, partly because it's much more convenient, and partly because at this point in November 2020, of course, it was the height of the pandemic, and there was lots of other good reasons for not going around in public any more than you absolutely had to. So the ultimate hope of this sort of intervention was that it would actually increase voter turnout, and that was the kind of the ultimate outcome that we looked at. So the first step in the campaign was to send cards to the voters, urging them to request a vote by mail ballot. And then for voters who didn't respond to that first round of requests, they also got a second similar round of requests. And then in the last part of the campaign, the folks who in fact had not responded at all would get another card saying, it's a good idea to go and vote early, and giving people information about how to vote early. And let me look now at some of the specifics of that campaign, and you can get a more precise picture of what we were doing. The postcard campaign for two counties were the ones that I looked at. One was Broward County, and the other one was Duval County. Broward is a very large county, and Duval is sort of medium-sized. In Broward, we looked at about 250,000 voters in terms of letters, and the very first page of the outside of the postcard that we sent had the Broward County Democratic Party, a little bit of a encouragement to vote by mail, and then obviously here was where the volunteers addressed the postcards. The second postcard was one with somewhat larger print invitations to vote by mail. A lot more information down here at the bottom in terms of going to a website to find out about voting by mail, or calling a phone number to find out about it. And then a message that, this is what the volunteers hand wrote in, a message to voters basically telling them or urging them to request a vote by mail ballot. But this postcard campaign was sort of interesting in that it really was two postcards in one, because attached to that first postcard was a second postcard, which had on it basically the vote by mail request form. So it had a copy of the vote by mail request form. A recipient, a voter who received the first card, could actually use this form and fill out all the information that was needed. And the second part of that card was actually addressed to the place where the cards could be sent in to request a vote by mail ballot. And then obviously the voter put in their return address up here. So the whole idea here was to make the process as easy and convenient for the voters as we could. Now, whoops, let me go back here. Now, for those who, one more, let's see here. For those who did not respond to these requests, then they ultimately received this vote early postcard, which gave them the dates for early voting, and there was the address that the volunteer would put in for the voter there, and again, places to find out more information about voting by early voting. And on the other side of this card, there were by the way, this happens to be from Miami-Dade. There were also cards for Broward and the other counties in Florida that we were working with. This would have on the other side of the card pictures of the early voting sites, the addresses of the early voting sites, and then more messaging about when it occurs and encouraging you to vote early. So that was the nature of the intervention. That sort of sequence of cards, and I would say that probably about 90% of the folks who were involved in the campaigns actually responded to the first card, and then another, 7 or 8% responded to the second card, and then finally the third card was sent out to a much smaller number of folks. So how do we proceed for evaluating this intervention? Well, as I said, we looked at 2 individual counties, Broward and Duval. Both counties had pretty large numbers of voters, and in each case, there were about 10% of the voters who we held out as sort of controls who received no cards. So we had a way to compare the voters who received cards and the voters who didn't receive cards. The outcome of interest, as I said, was looking at whether or not people actually voted. And we don't know how they voted, but just looking at whether or not they actually voted. And of course here, since we're targeting registered Democrats, the presumption was that if there were much of an increase in turnout, that the great bulk of that would be an increase in turnout for voting for Joe Biden and the rest of the Democratic ticket. Obviously, we needed various statistical procedures to control for differences between the card recipients and the control voters who got no cards. And I will say, by the way, we tend to hear about, you do a randomized control trial, and that kind of solves the problem of the difference between the control group and the treatment group. Well, that's not true, unless we're talking about agricultural plots or something like that. With human beings, usually there's so many different variations that could come into play that you really have to look very closely at whether your control group and your so-called treatment group actually are very comparable. And if they're not, then you have to use various kinds of statistical procedures to try to control for those differences. The data that we had, actually almost all of it came from public sources. The state of Florida public voter records, and many states, by the way, have these voter record files where whenever you register, as for example, we recently registered in Massachusetts when we moved up here, and we are now in the Massachusetts voter database, and in general that voter database is made publicly available to people who can pay for whatever it costs to actually produce it. The only thing that's typically not going to be on there will be how you voted, but it will have name, address, all sorts of stuff. We did also use some data from Census Bureau sources. That was mainly to control for differences in the characteristics of the places where people live. Did they live in a high-income area? Did they live in an area where there are lots of people who are highly educated? Or did they live in areas that were moderate or low income, lower level of education? But you can see here the kinds of things that will be on those voter files that we could actually look at. Their exact residence location, how old they were, their race, ethnicity, gender, and then, of course, whether or not they voted. And these cards do have on them, these files do have on them your history as a voter. So we could tell whether somebody voted in 2016 or 2018, as well as whether or not they voted in 2020. And that's going to turn out to be, I think, a very interesting piece of information that can be very useful going forward. Now, what did we find for the result of these evaluations? Well, there were differences between the two counties, which is important, and that's another theme we'll come back to. In Broward County, the postcards seemed to increase the overall turnout rate for all the people who received them on the order of 2 to 3%, which is a pretty big impact. For infrequent voters who had not voted in either the 2016 or 2018 elections, the effect of the postcards on the turnout was more than 12%, which is really very, very large. In Duval, we found a different set of results. There were not significant overall effects, unlike Broward, but it was interesting that while the effects tended to be much smaller, the one group that seemed to be most responsive to this kind of activity were folks who were infrequent voters, that is, the people who did not vote in 2016 or 2018. And I might add, sort of as an aside, who are the voters who didn't vote in 2016 or 2018? They could be young people, who some of them weren't even eligible for earlier years. They could be people who recently moved into the area, because we don't know from the Florida files where people voted in other states if they had moved in from a different state. And you could imagine why moving into a new area, you might be more responsive to this sort of communication and finding out more about how you can vote and how you can vote early. So those folks were quite responsive. And then the other were just people who, had simply, they were around in Florida, but they just did not vote in those prior years. So it was an interesting group, and a group that, as I say, consistently appeared to be more responsive. So the key takeaways from all this was that, first of all, postcard effects could be large enough to be important in close elections. Secondly, that they varied by geographic area, which was important. And third, that infrequent voters tended to be a particularly responsive group that might be good to target. Now, that's just my own very limited experience with this one particular set of activities in Florida involved with working with the Swing Blue Alliance folks. But of course, this kind of thing's been going on for quite a while and in many different places, and there are some other authoritative sources that have looked at many of these kinds of interventions, including there's a very interesting book from the Brookings Institution called Get Out the Vote, which was published pretty recently, that looks at hundreds of these different kinds of interventions. And there's also an outfit called the Analyst Institute, which reviews these sorts of volunteer activities on an ongoing basis, and comes out with annual reports. And I looked in particular at what they had said about the 2020 report, which would, of course, corresponded to the same election year that we studied in Florida. So what do these folks find in their expert reviews of many different campaigns? Well, first of all, that direct mail from volunteers did seem to increase voter turnout. That the effect was positive, but it tended to be pretty small. And Green and Gerber in that book, for example, showed that in 80 of the 106 programs that they reviewed that had positive impacts, but usually the impacts were small, and only 7 had impacts greater than 3%. So it's kind of at the low end of, similar to what we found, perhaps even a bit lower often. And of course, there were quite a few where the effects were statistically significant as well, both positive and negative. In In the Analyst Institute, they looked at quite, again, a very large number of these sorts of interventions, and again found out that direct get out the vote, that's what GOTV stands for, direct get out the vote mail from volunteers to registered voters was indeed effective. They also found out that if you include information on the card or the letter that you're sending out about how to request an absentee ballot, for instance, that did increase the overall turnout. And that's, of course, one of the things that we did in Florida, was to include that sort of information in the card itself. And third, that sending multiple rounds may be better in terms of increasing the turnout than simply sending one single round. And again, that's something we did in Florida, where, as I say, we had up to 3 rounds that we sent out to the voters. In terms of effect size, one study that campaign that the Analyst Institute looked at, which I think was very noteworthy, and some of you here may actually have been involved in this activity as volunteers in 2020, was there was a really large national effort by an outfit called Vote Forward, where they sent out get out the vote letters from volunteers to almost 5 million people. And it turned out when they looked at that whole study, the estimate of the increase in the turnout rate was more than 0.5%, but that's pretty small. However, it also was true that the effects state by state looked really different. For example, in Pennsylvania, which was the largest impact, there was a 3.5% impact. In Kansas, it was -2%. So again, this issue that you can't necessarily assume you're going to see the same impacts when you go from one area to another. So it's important to at least be aware of those potential differences when you're thinking about whether these campaigns were successful or not. Now, a general issue. I've been talking about, impacts on the order of 2-3%, sometimes bigger, but by and large in that general range. Is that really big enough to make a difference? That's an obvious question. And it turns out that I think there are reasons to think that it will make a difference in many cases. One reason is that lots of the elections that we can see from the recent past had margins that were very narrow. For example, when you looked at the presidential campaign and presidential election in 2020, there were 7 states where the difference between Biden and Trump, either in favor of Biden or in favor of Trump, were less than 3%. And some of them were as small as 0.6% or 0.3%, 0.2%. So in these 7 states, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, the margins were really close and well within that range of what we were talking about in terms of the effects we did observe in the literature and in our own work. And it turns out, by the way, if you think about how important these states are, well, these 7 states account for not quite 20% of all the electoral votes in the country. So that's a pretty big chunk of electoral votes in these 7 states. And then there were another 6 states that had slightly larger margins of difference, ranging from 3.4 to 8.2%, Florida, Iowa, Minnesota, New Hampshire, Ohio, Texas. And there again, these 6 states accounted for about 20% of the total electoral vote. So when we look at states with election margins that were less than 8%, for example, there were almost 40% of all the electoral votes in the country. Now, that may seem kind of surprising to you because we hear about how polarized we all are and how there's so few competitive congressional districts, and that basically we've all sorted ourselves out into deep blue and deep red areas. Well, at least in terms of statewide elections, for the states as a whole, that's often not the case. And so these states with very close margins seem to make a big difference in terms of the electoral outcome. There are a few other reasons to think that the impacts of this sort of volunteer activity this year, 2022, might be even larger than in 2020. And the main reason is that, according to the experts, in high salience elections like the presidential year, lots of people are apparently geared up and anxious enough to vote that sending them get out the vote mail is not going to make all that much difference. And that probably was true in 2020, because in fact in 2020 we had the largest turnout of any election in the history of the U.S. as far as we know. I think it was almost 80% of registered voters turned out. But midterm elections like 2022 are definitely not high salience. And if you look at the history, the turnout is half or less than half of what you see in the presidential elections. So we expect, given what these studies have suggested, that the effects of volunteer direct mail messages to registered voters could very well be greater in 2022 than they were in 2020. So there's yet another reason not to view the relatively small impacts that we observed in 2020 as suggesting that electoral outcomes will not be affected. One other point that we often don't think about much, these volunteer efforts are obviously sponsored by and managed by larger organizations. And those large organizations can have a real impact on the effectiveness of what the volunteers are doing just by the way that they organize and implement their campaigns. So what are the things that seem particularly interesting and important about looking at what the large organization that's sponsoring a volunteer effort are doing? What are the things that will be important in their impact? One is targeting. Remember, we talked about infrequent voters being more responsive. That's certainly one general targeting approach. It could be that it might make sense to target specific racial or ethnic groups or geographic areas, depending on the particular state that you're working in. It may also be important to focus on states where you think, or states or districts where you think that the electoral outcome is going to be close, because there even a 2 or 3 or 4% impact is more likely to actually strongly impact the overall outcome of the election. So the targeting is a big issue. Next question is the messages that the voters put on their letters or cards. Those messages are basically directed from the organizations who send out templates of what you should be saying and what you should be putting on the cards. And so the question is, are those messages or on the letters or cards messages that will in fact engage the voters, that voters will respond to? If read through some of the studies that I've talked about before, it turns out that some things, like simply reminding people that there will be an election at a particular time, tend not to have much effect at all. So what you say beyond just saying there's an election makes a big difference in terms of how responsive the voters will be, and what the specifics of what you say could be important. Beyond that, there's also things that the organization who's managing a volunteer campaign can do apart from what the volunteers are doing. One of those categories of things is following up, trying to maintain contact with the voters who are reached by the campaign, following up in terms of examining the outcomes of the volunteer contacts, learning more about what works and what doesn't work. Does the organization that's managing the campaign that you're volunteering for have a good strategy to do that? And finally, some of these organizations that are mounting these campaigns also have lots of other parallel efforts that they undertake to enhance the effects of the volunteers' efforts in direct messaging to voters. So this could be, first of all, do they carefully test before they scale up to have you put out lots of volunteer letters for a campaign? Do they run paid media advertising at the same time that you're running, that you and other volunteers are sending out letters directly to voters? Do they follow up with other kinds of techniques like social media or texting contacts to potential voters? So these kinds of things often have been found to have important enhancement impacts in terms of multiplying the effects of what the volunteer is doing in sending out the letters or postcards. So the bottom line here, there are hundreds of programs out there, and some of them probably have a good chance, I think, of being effective in implementing election outcomes, but there's some that may not. So what are the keys to effective programs? We've already talked about one, targeting, especially targeting tight races in swing states or districts. You could be targeting an entire state. You could be targeting a congressional district. You could be targeting even a state legislative district. Are they targeting tight races? Are they targeting voter groups who are most likely to be affected by the messages? And are they providing organizational support that enhances the impact of you and the other volunteer letter or card writers? So what can we do? Well, as volunteers, we can inform ourselves. We can find out, for example, who is the organization sponsoring a volunteer effort? What have they been doing? What are their plans in terms of how they operate? What groups are they targeting? What are the other enhancement means that they use to increase the impact of your own letters? So the bottom line here is that I think your own volunteer time is scarce, and you need to think about, does it make sense to actually spend time based on what you know about the organization and what you're guessing would be their likely impact, and then decide, is it something that makes sense to you to go ahead and do? So on the bottom line is, when you see these various notes coming through about about volunteer programs that are looking for people to help, and looking for you in particular to help, check them out along these lines, make a decision about programs that look to you like they should make a difference, and if you find ones that do, and I think if you look carefully enough you will, then pitch in and get involved. And that's the main message that I wanted to end up with here.